a Sunday morning in February of 2024, I sat down at my kitchen table in Tampa, Florida, with a second cup of coffee and a printout from a public government website, and I ran a query on a computer system I had built with my own hands. The query asked how many people were currently enrolled in my company's subsidized health insurance plans in a single zip code in Opa-locka. The number that came back was 411. According to the United States Census Bureau and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the total number of people in that zip code who were actually eligible for the kind of plan my company sold was 38. And I had written every line of the system that returned the number 411. I am going to tell you what I did about it. It took me 3 years. It took me 14 notebooks. It took me 22 months of silence under a federal court seal. And at the end of it, a company worth roughly $300 million was placed into federal receivership. 2 of its executives were indicted on wire fraud and healthcare fraud. $147.8 million was recovered for the United States Treasury, and 12,417 people were notified that their names had been used, without their knowledge, in a scheme that fed off the federal government and off the dead. My name is Victor Kane. This is the story of the platform I built, and the platform that was taken from me, and what I did when I realized the difference. I was 58 years old on the morning I ran that query. I had been the principal systems architect at Meridian Coverage Solutions for 10 years. I had designed the enrollment platform from an empty whiteboard in the spring of 2014, when the company was 40 people in a rented office on West Shore Boulevard. I am 61 now. I am telling you this story from a house I no longer own, in a neighborhood I have since left, and I am telling it slowly and in order because I do not believe what happened can be understood any other way. If you are impatient, I understand, but I would ask you to stay. The names are real in the sense that matters, even where I have changed them. The numbers are exact. The government records will bear them out. My older sister, Elena Kane, died on the 29th of September, 2011. She was 49 years old. Elena had been a regional sales manager for a paper products distributor in Brandon, just east of Tampa, for 19 years, and she had been laid off at the beginning of 2010 during the long aftermath of the housing collapse. She took the severance, and she took unemployment, and she told my mother she was looking, and she was, but the work she was qualified for had gone away. The insurance from her job ran out 90 days after the layoff. She was 47 years old, and she had been healthy her entire life. She did not look for new insurance. I do not know exactly why. She told me once, late, that she thought the Affordable Care Act had just passed, and that something would be set up by the time she actually needed it. She did not actually need it until she did, and by then, she did not have time. Elena died of viral myocarditis. The coroner wrote on her death certificate that the inflammation of her heart muscle had been progressing for approximately 6 to 8 months, and that with early diagnosis and appropriate outpatient monitoring, the case would have been survivable. Elena never saw a doctor during those 6 to 8 months. She could not afford to. She was 49 years old when my mother found her on her couch on a Thursday afternoon. My mother called me at work. I drove from my office in downtown Tampa to Elena's apartment in Brandon in 23 minutes. I did not speed. I remember not speeding. I remember not wanting to get there in a way that I could not explain to my mother on the phone. I tell you about Elena because nothing I am about to describe makes sense without her. I was a software engineer for enterprise consulting firms for 12 years. I was an engineer on 2 large healthcare data projects for another 7. I was good at my work. I did not care about it in the way I would later learn to care. When the Affordable Care Act was passed in March of 2010, I paid attention the way anyone who does healthcare data pays attention, which is to say, I read the implementation rules and I thought about which of my clients would be affected. Elena's death, 18 months after the law was signed, was the first time I understood that a thing called health insurance enrollment infrastructure was not a market segment. It was a room that people either could or could not walk into. Elena had not been able to walk into that room. Somebody had to build the room properly. I decided the somebody would be me. I left my consulting practice in the fall of 2013. I spent 8 months interviewing with carriers, with call centers, with federal contractors, with nonprofit navigator organizations. In the spring of 2014, a man named Reuben Shaw, who had started a small third-party enrollment vendor out of a rented floor on West Shore Boulevard with 3 partners and $42,000, called me and asked if I would come and build what he called a serious platform. Reuben was a former actuary. He had left a carrier to start Meridian because he had the same sickness I had, which was the belief that enrollment done correctly could be the difference between somebody like Elena seeing a doctor and somebody like Elena dying on a couch. Reuben did not know about Elena. I did not tell him. I told him I would take the job. I took an equity stake of 2.1%. I took a base salary that was lower than my consulting average, and I took the title of Principal Systems Architect, which I chose myself because it was accurate and because it meant what I wanted it to mean. I started on the 7th of April, 2014. I built the platform from nothing. I want to describe what that meant in some detail because later, the meaning of the platform and the meaning of the word architect became the center of the humiliation that was done to me, and you will not understand the humiliation unless you understand the work. An enrollment platform, in the sense that mattered to me, was the set of instructions that decided what happened from the moment a person arrived at an intake channel, either by phone or by the federal website or through a broker portal, and the moment that same person became a legally enrolled member of a health insurance plan whose premium was being paid to a carrier, in some cases by the person, in some cases by the federal government through something called an advance premium tax credit, which most people at the time called a subsidy. My job was to design that instruction set so that it was honest. Honest, in this case, meant a great many specific things. Honest authentication, meaning the person on the phone was actually the person being enrolled. Honest eligibility determination, meaning the person's income and household size and residency were matched against the public program rules accurately. Honest consent, meaning the person had actually consented to be enrolled in the specific plan in question. Honest transmission, meaning the right information went to the right federal gateway in the right format at the right time. Honest record, meaning a compliant audit trail was written in such a way that if a federal inspector arrived with a subpoena tomorrow, the inspector could see exactly what had happened and in what order. I wrote the architecture to do all of those things. I wrote the specifications. I wrote the patterns. I did not write all the source code myself. We had a team of engineers, eventually 58 of them, and each of them was qualified, and each of them I trusted. What I wrote, for 11 years, was the book of how the system was supposed to think. I wrote it in 14 bound composition notebooks, one for each year and a second for 2017, which was a consequential year. I wrote in them every day, and I kept them at my desk at home on a shelf I built for them in 2015 out of oak from a tree that came down in my backyard in a hurricane in 2014. The shelf is still in that house. The notebooks were at that desk for 11 years. If you have not worked as the sole architect of a federally regulated software system for more than a decade, you may not understand why the notebooks existed. Let me explain briefly. Every architectural decision I made, why a soft validation existed here, why a hard validation existed there, why a retry was allowed in one place and forbidden in another, why the audit subsystem recorded an event at this exact timestamp rather than that one. Every decision had a reason. The reasons did not live in the source code. The source code only expressed the decision. It could not explain the decision. I wrote the reasons in the notebooks. When a junior engineer 3 years later needed to change something, I could open the right notebook to the right page and point to the reason. When my old employment contract was negotiated in 2014, I insisted on a clause, Section 7.4, which identified the notebooks as my personal intellectual work product as the architect, not company property. Reuben signed it without argument. I kept my notebooks. In 2017, I added something to the platform that would matter later. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the federal agency that runs the marketplace, had published a new set of compliance expectations under 45 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 164, and 42 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 455, requiring third-party enrollment vendors to maintain a federally retained audit trail of every enrollment action taken through their platforms, immutable for 7 years, independent of the operational database, queryable by federal examiners on request. I designed the Audit Subsystem. I built it as a read-only query layer that silently wrote every single enrollment action to a federally mandated retention store as a secondary effect of the normal operational database write. I gave it a name, the CMS Compliance Audit Subsystem, or CCAS. I provisioned read-only credentials for myself as the system author and for the compliance officer, whoever she or he was at the time. I wrote the documentation for it. I wrote the architectural rationale in the 2017 notebook, the one with the 2 volumes. On page 83 of the second volume, I made a note to myself. I will read you that note now because it mattered more than I knew at the time. I wrote, "Independent channel, read only for architect role, never revoke without written architectural sign-off, intended as a fail-safe against future management that does not remember why compliance is the ground floor and not a cost center." I was 36 years old when I wrote those words. I did not have any particular future management in mind. I had worked long enough at that point to know that companies forget. I wanted the system to remember, even if the company did not. Meridian grew. In 2018, we were 110 people. In 2020, we were 240. In 2022, we were 312. We had contracts with 3 regional insurers, one in Florida, one based in Tennessee with a Georgia operation, one Texas-based, and we operated the back end for 2 federally contracted call centers serving the full marketplace in the same 3 states. Our compliance record was clean. Our authentication success rate, meaning the percentage of claimed enrollments that passed identity and consent verification, was 98.4%. Our federal audit findings over 8 years amounted to 4 minor documentation corrections, all resolved within 30 days of notice. Reuben Shaw retired in June of 2022. He was 61. He was tired. His wife had been asking him for 3 years. He left the company to an interim CEO appointed by the board, a man named Brett Vanderhoof, who was a steady hand but not an operator. Brett understood he was a placeholder. The board went looking for a permanent CEO. I understood at the time that this was normal, and I did not pay very close attention. I was the architect. The platform was running. I had a team. I was writing in my notebook. My mother was 81 years old that year, and she needed me on Sundays. I was not watching the board. In September of 2023, a private equity firm called Wentworth Capital Partners bought 62% of Meridian from its founding shareholders, including Reuben, including the partners, including a portion of my stake, for approximately $280 million. I was paid $2.7 million for the portion of my equity I was required to sell. The money sat in an account for 8 months before I did anything with it. I did not celebrate. I understood exactly what a private equity recapitalization meant for a third-party services vendor in a regulated industry. I had seen it in consulting. I knew what was coming. I just did not know yet who it would be wearing. In October of 2023, Wentworth installed a new chief operating officer. His name was Dalton Reese. He was 44 years old. His background, which I read before meeting him, was pharmaceutical sales. He had been a district sales director at Eli Lilly, he had been a vice president of channel strategy at Cardinal Health, and he had a Georgetown Master's of Business Administration from 2009. He had never worked in health insurance enrollment. He had never worked in healthcare compliance. He had never worked in software. He had the face of a man who had learned in graduate school that it was possible to run a business you did not understand if you understood the metrics. His first town hall was on the 6th of October, 2023. I was in the 3rd row. He used the phrase enrollment velocity 4 times in the first 9 minutes. I wrote the phrase in my 2023 notebook. I underlined it. I did not know yet what it would come to mean, but I recognized the sound of it. I had heard it before, in other rooms, in other years, said by men who would later be indicted, or fired, or simply quietly exited after their quarter. The same week, Wentworth also installed a chief growth officer. Her name was Sabrina Lowell. She was 38. Her background was sales commission structure design. She had worked at Kaiser Permanente, at a company called Health Markets, at eHealth. She had designed, at each of those places, the compensation architecture for the enrollment sales force. She was, in other words, a systems architect too. Her systems were incentive systems, not software systems. Her job at Meridian was to redesign how the enrollment call center operators and the broker channels were paid, in a way that would, in Dalton's language, unlock enrollment velocity. I met her on the same afternoon I met Dalton. She shook my hand. She looked at my face for a half-second longer than was comfortable. She said, "You're the architect." I said, "I am." She said, "We'll have to find a way to make sure you feel heard in this next phase." She did not speak to me directly again for 19 months. On the 1st of November 2023, Sabrina rolled out a new compensation structure for the call center operators and the broker channels. The structure replaced a flat salary plus small performance bonus with a per-enrollment commission ranging from $42 to $78 per completed enrollment, tiered by plan type, paid monthly. The call center went from an average operator compensation of $46,000 a year to a potential range of $38,000 to $112,000 a year, depending on volume. I was not consulted on the change. I read the internal announcement. I opened my notebook and I wrote, "Commission per enrollment, no ceiling, no decoupling from authentication rate, predictable emergence, pressure on soft validation paths, monitor." I signed the entry and dated it. It is a single page in the 2023 notebook. It does not say what is about to happen. I did not know yet. I was watching the structure of the incentive, and I was already uneasy. At the end of January 2024, the company's internal quarterly metrics showed enrollment volume was up 140% year over year. Dalton sent a company-wide email with the subject line, "Velocity Unlocked." He said the numbers were what this engine was built to do. He said he wanted to thank every single operator, every broker, every leader who has made this possible. He did not thank the engineering team or the architect. I noticed. I was not offended in the way you might assume. I was alert. 140% growth in 90 days, with no change in marketing spend, no change in carrier network, no new states, no new channels, and the only variable in the system being a new commission structure was not a healthy number. It was a tell. On a Sunday morning in February, I made my second cup of coffee and I sat down at my kitchen table and I ran the query on Opa-locka that started this story. I need to tell you what the query was and why it told me what it told me, because it matters. The query used the public data published by CMS on its Research and Statistics page, combined with the internal aggregate enrollment totals that Meridian published on its own internal compliance dashboard, which I still had permission to view because my roll card had not been changed. I also used a third data set, which was the United States Census Bureau's American Community Survey, which publishes by zip code the distribution of household income and age, and from which it is possible to estimate with reasonable precision the count of people who would be eligible for a subsidized marketplace plan. I had written, in 2019, a personal piece of analytical software that performed this estimation automatically. It was my hobby, not my job. I had been curious about enrollment density patterns because I wanted to understand where our platform was reaching the right populations and where it was not. I ran the analysis once a quarter for my own satisfaction. I had never seen a number that was off by a factor of 10. The number of plausibly eligible ACA marketplace enrollees in that Opa-locka zip code, based on census and CMS, was approximately 38. The number of enrollees on my company's books for that same zip code was 411. I ran the query for a second zip code in Liberty City, Miami. The census-adjusted plausible eligible count was 51. The internal enrollment number was 493. I ran it for a third, in Overtown. 62 eligible, 520 enrolled. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the coffee. I was very careful about what I did in the next 10 minutes. I did not call anyone. I did not write an email. I did not open any internal system other than the one I had already been looking at. I stood up. I walked to my desk in the Florida room I had converted to a home office in 2016, and I pulled the 2024 notebook off the shelf. I turned to the first blank page. The date was the 11th of February, 2024. I wrote one line. I wrote, Opa-locka, 411. Actual estimate 38. Twofold would be a mistake. Tenfold is a decision. I closed the notebook. I put it back on the shelf. I poured out the coffee. I drove to my mother's apartment. I made her breakfast. I went to 8 o'clock Mass at St. Lawrence. I did not tell her. I did not tell anyone. I spent the next 3 weeks confirming. I ran the analysis for every zip code in Meridian's operating territory. There were 6,142 zip codes. 3,961 showed enrollment numbers that were within normal statistical variance of the census-adjusted estimates. 2,144 showed enrollment numbers that were below the estimates, which is normal in a competitive market. 37 zip codes showed enrollment numbers that were between 7 and 14 times higher than the estimate. I plotted the 37 on a map. 21 were in Florida, 9 were in Georgia, 7 were in Texas. I looked at each one individually. They shared characteristics that I could not unsee. They were areas of extreme poverty. They contained the highest homelessness concentrations in their respective metropolitan areas. They contained populations that, by demographic, were likely to be Medicaid eligible and therefore, by law, were ineligible for subsidized marketplace plans. They were not places where a surge of marketplace enrollment was plausible. They were places where, if anything, marketplace enrollment should have been declining as Medicaid expansion advocacy reached the relevant populations. The 37 zip codes, taken together, contained a claimed enrollment total on Meridian's books of approximately 12,400 people in excess of plausible eligibility. I wrote the number in my notebook. I did not understand yet what was producing the number. I wrote, 12,400. Cause unknown. Explanations I will not accept without proof. First, my estimation model is wrong by an order of magnitude across 37 independent geographic observations. Second, these zip codes contain anomalous demographic features invisible to census. Third, the commission structure has produced an unintended operational drift that operators are themselves unaware of. Explanation I will investigate. Deliberate falsification. On the 9th of March, 2024, I wrote a formal memorandum. The memorandum was 4 pages. It was addressed to Dalton Reese, Chief Operating Officer, Sabrina Lowell, Chief Growth Officer, and Melissa Crosby, Chief Technology Officer, who was my direct report chain and who had been hired the previous summer and whom I did not yet fully know. I copied Brett Vanderhoof, the interim CEO who had stayed on as a board advisor, and I copied the Chief Compliance Officer, a woman named Penny Arroyo, who had been with Meridian since 2018. The memorandum described the statistical anomaly. It did not use the word fraud. It used the words enrollment density variance. It identified the 37 zip codes. It described the estimation methodology. It recommended 2 things. First, an independent forensic audit of the authentication and consent capture logs for every enrollment in the 37 zip codes over the preceding 12 months. Second, a temporary hold on new enrollments from those zip codes pending the audit. I ended the memorandum with a single sentence. I wrote, "In my capacity as principal systems architect, I am obligated to raise this to the company's attention. I trust the leadership team to take it seriously." I printed 3 copies. I hand-delivered one to Dalton's assistant. I hand-delivered one to Sabrina's assistant. I put the 3rd in a manila folder in my desk at home. I sent the digital version to all 5 addressees by company email at 11:47 in the morning on a Wednesday. I did not BCC anyone. I did not keep a personal copy outside the folder at home and the sent mail folder in the company account. I did not call anyone. I went back to work. For 11 days, nothing happened. On the 21st of March, Dalton replied. His reply was 4 sentences. He thanked me for my thoroughness. He said he had shared the memorandum with Sabrina and Melissa. He said the observations were interesting and deserved a thorough response. He said he would schedule a meeting to discuss. The meeting did not happen. On the 25th of March, his assistant, a woman named Kaylee, emailed me that the meeting was being moved to align with the COO's travel schedule and that she would follow up. She did not follow up. On the 8th of April, I emailed Dalton asking if he had been able to review. He did not reply. On the 15th of April, I copied Melissa Crosby and asked the same question. Melissa replied the same day. She said she had read the memorandum and that it raised legitimate questions for operational review, and that she had asked her deputy, a man named Cody Brenner, to look into it. Cody Brenner was 29 years old and had been at the company for 7 weeks. He reported to Melissa. I did not hear from Cody Brenner. On the 20th of April, I took a different step. I went to see Penny Arroyo, the chief compliance officer, in her office. Penny was 53. She had been a compliance officer at a large carrier before coming to Meridian. She was the reason I had slept well on most nights for 6 years. I closed her door. I sat down. I asked her what she had done with my memorandum. Penny looked at me for a long time. She said she had logged it in the compliance register on the day she received it. She said she had requested a compliance review. She said she had been told by Dalton that the issue was being handled at the platform level and that her review was premature. She said she had documented that response. She did not tell me what she intended to do next. I looked at her. She looked at me. We both understood what was happening. I did not ask her to do anything she did not have standing to do. I thanked her. I left. On the 7th of May, 2024, a woman named Amara Feldman, who was a senior compliance analyst reporting to Penny, submitted an 11-page confidential internal audit memorandum. I did not know she existed. I did not know her memorandum existed for another 9 months. Amara's memorandum analyzed, from an entirely different angle than mine, the same 37 zip codes. Her analysis was based on authentication failure retry patterns in the enrollment intake flow. She had observed that the rate of soft override events in which an enrollment proceeded even after an authentication check had returned an ambiguous result, had increased by 4,000% in the preceding 6 months, and that the soft overrides were concentrated in the same 37 zip codes. Her memorandum recommended a forensic audit of the authentication subsystem and a temporary hold on new enrollments from the affected zips. The recommendation was almost word for word what mine had been. Neither of us knew the other had written it. On the 18th of June, 2024, Meridian held its quarterly town hall. It was at 2 in the afternoon in the 12th floor conference room of our building on West Shore Boulevard. The 12th floor had a large open area with glass walls overlooking the bay. All 318 employees were there. Dalton opened with the numbers. Enrollment volume was up 178% year over year. He said the phrase, "We are running the fastest engine in this market." He said the phrase, "Enrollment velocity is the engine of growth." He said the phrase, "We have to recognize the foundations this is built on." And then he called me by name. He asked me to come to the front. I stood up from the 3rd row and I walked to the front. I remember my hands were dry. I remember feeling nothing in particular. I remember that Sabrina Lowell was standing to the side of the screen, smiling. Dalton said, and I will give you his words as I remember them, which is precisely because I wrote them down that night. Victor Kane has been the principal systems architect of Meridian for 10 years. Victor built the house we all live in. He wrote the architecture. He laid the foundation. This company exists because a man sat in a small office in 2014 and believed it should exist. I want to recognize Victor today, and I want to announce a strategic elevation. He handed me a rectangular object wrapped in white paper. He asked me to unwrap it at the microphone. I unwrapped it. Inside was a glass award, a rectangular slab about 6 inches tall, heavy, cut and polished, with text etched into its face. The text read, "Architect Emeritus, for the foundation you gave us, Meridian Coverage Solutions, 2024. I looked at the award. I looked at Dalton. I looked at the room. Dalton said, "Victor, we are moving you to a dedicated office space, a curated environment for you to focus on next-generation platform architecture. The view is beautiful. You are going to love it. This is a strategic elevation." There was applause. There was a small laugh somewhere. Dalton asked me if I would like to say a few words. I thought for perhaps 2 seconds. I said, "Thank you. I hope the platform continues to serve the members we built it for." I said it flatly, and I meant it flatly. I held the glass award in my right hand. Dalton said, "Always the architect." He laughed. The room laughed politely. I sat back down. I did not drop the award. I walked back to my seat, holding it with 2 hands. I put it under my chair for the remainder of the town hall. I want to tell you what I understood in those 75 seconds between standing up from the 3rd row and sitting back down with the award under my chair. I understood that my memorandum had been received. I understood that Sabrina Lowell had designed a response that did not involve firing me, because firing a man who had just filed a formal written concern about enrollment integrity would be documentation-grade grounds for a whistleblower retaliation claim under the False Claims Act, which I do not know if she knew about by name, but somebody on her team did. I understood that instead, I was being moved out of the engineering floor into an office that would isolate me from the platform and from the team that ran it. I understood that my badge access was about to change. I understood that my name was about to come off the engineering organizational chart. I understood that the retention grant I had been granted 8 months earlier, worth $214,000, vested 62 days from that Tuesday, and that if I resigned in that window, I would forfeit the grant, and that Sabrina and Dalton had almost certainly calculated the 62 days into the timing. I understood that they wanted me to resign. I understood that if I stayed and accepted the elevation, they would expect me to keep my mouth shut and collect my vesting and disappear into early retirement. I understood that this was the moment. I sat with the glass award under my chair, and I listened to Sabrina present the 3rd quarter growth forecast, and I made a decision. The decision was that I was going to stay. I was going to appear to disappear. I was going to collect my vesting, and I was going to write down everything. I was going to build, in my own time, what my platform should have been allowed to produce on its own. I was going to do it correctly, under seal, with a real attorney, with a real evidentiary record, with the kind of slow care that I had been taught by Reuben Shaw in the first decade of this company, and that these 2 people and their private equity owners did not possess. I walked back to my old desk the next morning. I sat for 2 hours. At 9 o'clock, a facilities manager arrived with a moving cart. He was polite. He said he had been sent to help me move. He asked me where I wanted my things. He said, "Mr. Kane, I was told to show you your new office. It is on the same floor. Would you like to see it now?" I said yes. The new office was on the east side of the building, behind the engineering floor, down a corridor that led to the supply closets in the printer room. The door had no nameplate. He opened the door. Inside was an interior office with no window, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, previously used as a supply closet. The walls had been painted white within the last week. There was a single desk against the far wall. On the desk was a single computer, a standard workstation with its case unlocked, meaning I could see that the network card was not the same as the engineering standard. There was a single office chair. There was a single overhead fluorescent fixture. The fixture buzzed at approximately 240 hertz, a pitch that was exactly audible if you were listening for it, and that became background if you stopped. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The facilities manager said, "Let me know if you need anything else, sir." I thanked him. I moved in my things from the engineering floor. The things were a coffee mug from 1993 that had been my father's, which I had kept at my desk for 11 years. A small framed photograph of Elena at her niece's christening, taken 2 weeks before Elena died. A plaque that Reuben Shaw had given me on my 5th anniversary with the company, which read, "For Victor Kane, whose discipline is the company's conscience." A reference copy of the 45 CFR HIPAA privacy rule with my annotations, and the notebook I was then using, which was the 2024 notebook, not yet full. I did not move any of the previous 13 notebooks from the home office. They had never been at the Meridian building. They were never at the Meridian building at any point. I moved the glass award onto the corner of the desk. I sat down in the chair. The fluorescent fixture buzzed. I opened the 2024 notebook. I wrote on a fresh page. Date, 18 June 2024. Office, interior, no window. Access, restricted. Badge, pending reduction. Duration to vesting, 62 days. Plan, stay. I closed the notebook. I went down to the cafeteria and I bought a coffee. I came back. The fluorescent fixture buzzed. I began the first project I had been assigned in the new role, which was a strategic study titled Next Generation Enrollment Architecture, Futures Horizon 2026 to 2035. There was no team assigned to me. There was no budget. There was no deliverable date. It was a made-up project. I worked on it for exactly the hours I was expected to work. I arrived at 8:30. I left at 5:30. I was never a minute late and never a minute early. I ate my lunch at my desk. I did not go to any meetings that I was not invited to. I was not invited to any meetings. On the Monday after the town hall, my badge access changed. I could enter the quiet room, the cafeteria, the elevator, the lobby, and the restrooms on my floor. I could not enter the engineering floor, the operations floor, the conference rooms on 11 or 12, the data center on 3, or the executive floor. I noted the changes in the notebook. I did not protest. My name was removed from the engineering organizational chart posted in the internal directory within 48 hours. A new chart was issued showing me reporting to Dalton directly under a new node called Strategic Architecture Initiatives, with 0 other personnel reporting to me. I noted it. The retention grant vested on the 19th of August. I collected $214,000, net of tax withholding $128,000, into my brokerage account. I moved the money to a separate account at a credit union across town. I did not spend any of it. I want to describe the next 90 days briefly, because a great deal of what I built for the government began here. In late July, I began a practice which I maintained without a single exception for the next 18 months. Every Sunday, between 8:30 and 11 in the morning, I sat at my kitchen table at home with a printed copy of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services enrollment aggregate data, which is updated weekly and is publicly available, and I ran queries against the CMS Compliance Audit Subsystem, the Audit Subsystem I had built in 2017, using the read-only credentials that had been provisioned for me and that no one had remembered to revoke. The subsystem was still running. It was silently logging every enrollment action on the platform to the federally mandated retention store, exactly as I had designed it to. The operational team did not know it was running because it had been filed in the post-PE organizational audit under decommissioned infrastructure. It was not decommissioned. It was a core compliance artifact retained in production under CMS rules, invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. I knew to look for it. It was mine. I queried it every Sunday. I pulled 52 distinct fields per enrollment event. I saved the exports on a single external drive kept in a fire-rated document safe in my home office. I logged each session in the 2024 notebook and then the 2025 notebook. I never queried it from the Meridian building. I never queried it on a Meridian-owned device. I never spoke a word about it to anyone at Meridian. In September of 2024, a man named Terrence Abrams began leaving me envelopes. Terrence was 52 years old. He had been my direct report from 2017 to 2022. After I was moved to the quiet room, Terrence had been promoted by Dalton to Director of Platform Operations. He did not come with me. I did not expect him to. Terrence had 3 children and a mortgage and a wife with a chronic illness that required regular care. I did not judge him for taking the promotion. I had trained him. He was competent. He was not a bad man. He was, it turned out, carrying something he did not want to carry alone. On the first Sunday of September, I came out of the 8 o'clock Mass at St. Lawrence with my mother, and we walked the 3 blocks back to her apartment together the way we always did. There is a small park next to her building. There is a particular wooden bench beside the park's north entrance, under a live oak, that my mother and I had been sitting on for 20 years. On that first Sunday, as I walked past the bench, I saw a plain white business envelope resting on the slats. It was unmarked. I did not pick it up in front of my mother. I walked her upstairs. I made her breakfast. I came back down. The envelope was still there. I picked it up. I put it in my jacket pocket. I drove home. In my kitchen, I opened it. Inside were 4 printouts. They were screenshots, printed on plain paper, of internal Meridian Slack messages between Dalton Reese and Sabrina Lowell, dated across the preceding month. One of them read, verbatim, "Need soft override paths cleaner for Sabrina's team. Can't have audit flag storms. Velocity is the story." Another, from Sabrina to Dalton, read, "The brokers in the Atlanta cluster are hitting their ceiling. Commission caps are political. Give me 90 days and I can make the case." A third was a screenshot of the commission payout ledger for one of the Florida territories, showing that a single operator had been paid on 680 enrollments in a single month. The fourth was a screenshot of an internal CRM entry in which an enrollment had been completed with a timestamp that preceded the initial phone call timestamp by 14 minutes. It was not possible, under normal system behavior, for an enrollment to be completed before the call that generated it began. The timestamps had been manually edited. I looked at all 4 pieces of paper. I put them in a folder. I put the folder in the fire-rated safe in my home office. I wrote in the 2024 notebook, "Terrence, 4 printouts, St. Lawrence, North Bench, 1 Sunday per month anticipated. No communication." I was correct. For the next 7 months, every first Sunday, there was an envelope on the bench. 4 printouts per envelope. 28 printouts total before the seal period began. Terrence and I did not speak a word about it. He never sent me a text. He never sent me an email. He never came to the quiet room. We nodded to each other across the cafeteria once in November, and that was the closest we came to any form of exchange. I kept the printouts. I cataloged them. I did not use them until I had to. In late October of 2024, I sent a LinkedIn connection request to a woman named Amara Feldman, who I had identified, through lateral research, as the senior compliance analyst who had left Meridian quietly in August. She accepted the connection on a Wednesday morning. I sent her a private message that read, in full, "Ms. Feldman, I am Victor Kane, formerly Principal Systems Architect at Meridian. I believe we shared a concern during our overlap there. I would value a short conversation, in person if possible. No company business at any company premises. At your convenience." She replied 40 minutes later. She wrote, "I will meet you at the public library on Coconut Grove Drive in Sarasota next Saturday at 10 in the morning. I'd like to bring a friend. I would prefer you bring nothing." I agreed. I drove to Sarasota on a Saturday morning in early November. I parked 2 blocks from the library. I walked in empty-handed. Amara Feldman was in a corner of the reference section. She was 31 years old. She had short, dark hair. She had with her a woman in her 60s who did not introduce herself and whose posture I recognized immediately as a lawyer's. Amara said, "Mr. Kane, start." I told her what I had found. I told her exactly what I had found, and I told her how I had found it. I did not mention the audit subsystem by name. I told her I had independently developed, through public data, a statistical model that suggested 12,400 excessive enrollments in 37 zip codes, concentrated in areas with high homelessness and Medicaid ineligibility overlap. I told her about the commission structure change. I told her about the velocity language. I told her I had filed a formal memorandum in March and that nothing had been done.
I told her about the elevation. I told her about the quiet room.
Amara listened. When I finished, she was silent for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she said, "I filed a memorandum. It was about the authentication subsystem. I found the same 37 zip codes by the same arithmetic by a different route. They marked my memorandum resolved in July without action. I quit in August." She looked at the older woman, and the older woman nodded slightly. Amara reached into a canvas tote bag and pulled out a plain manila folder. She placed it on the table between us. She said, "There is an original printed copy of my memo dated stamp at filing. There is a copy of the email I sent with the memo, original. There is my own personal encrypted backup with the BCC to myself, printed from my personal email. There are 2 pages of notes I took during my last meeting with Penny Arroyo. Everything is dated. Everything has my signature." I opened the folder briefly. I closed it. I said, "Ms. Feldman, I want to use these in the correct legal structure. Are you prepared to speak to federal investigators at some point in the future?" Amara said, "Yes, I have been waiting." The older woman said, her first and last words of the meeting, "Mr. Kane, you should retain counsel immediately. The longer you have been documenting, the more careful that part becomes." I thanked them both. I took the folder. I walked out of the library. I put the folder in a briefcase in the trunk of my car. I drove straight home. I put the folder in the fire-rated safe. I sat down in my Florida room, and I did nothing for about an hour. Then I stood up and I began to research key TAM attorneys in South Florida with backgrounds in HHS Office of Inspector General work. I was looking for a specific profile. I found it after a week. His name was Marshall Ortega. Before I describe Marshall, I want to describe the work I did in November and December of 2024, because it was the work that mattered, and it was the work that a listener should understand before the story shifts to the law. I had 2 data sets I trusted, my own weekly exports from the Audit Subsystem and the public CMS enrollment aggregates. I had one more data set I now began to build, and which I had not yet combined with the others. I began to pull, from public county records offices across Florida, Georgia, and Texas, the complete death indexes for each county in which the 37 zip codes were located. The Florida Department of Health publishes vital statistics. The Texas Department of State Health Services publishes them under an open records framework. The Georgia Department of Public Health publishes them with some additional steps. The data include, for each person deceased in the relevant county, the full legal name at time of death, the date of birth, the date of death, the sex, the last known zip code, the cause of death category, and the last 4 digits of the Social Security number in most cases. I downloaded every available year. It took me 4 weekends. I wrote a cross-reference routine in plain Python on my personal laptop on a subnet not connected to my home office machine, which ran the CMS queries. I cross-referenced the Meridian enrollment records for the 37 zip codes against the county death indexes. The result, when it finished running at 2:30 on a Sunday morning in January of 2025, was this. Of the 12,417 excessive enrollments in those 37 zip codes over the preceding 26 months, 1,914 of them were enrollments of persons whose date of death preceded their date of enrollment by a period ranging from 3 months to 11 years. 1,914 dead people had been enrolled in federally subsidized health insurance plans by my company's platform, using my own architecture, and monthly advance premium tax credit payments had been made by the federal government to my company on their behalf, every month since each enrollment. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the number. 1,914. I got up. I walked out to the backyard. It was maybe 50 degrees. I stood on the grass in my bare feet for about 5 minutes. I came back in. I opened the 2025 notebook. I wrote, 1,914 confirmed deceased enrollees. Identities harvested from public records and linked into active plans. Monthly federal payments continuing. Scheme shape now visible. Proceed to council. I closed the notebook. I went to bed at 3:50. I slept for 4 hours. I went to 8 o'clock Mass. I told my mother none of it. Marshal Ortega's office was in a small mid-rise building in Brickell, in downtown Miami, across the street from a parking garage with a mural of a heron on the west side. Marshal was 56. He had been a senior investigator for the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General for 20 years, and had moved into private practice in 2018 to work False Claims Act qui tam relator cases. He had, as his website stated carefully, settled 11 FCA cases in his practice, with recoveries totaling $940 million, and with relator shares averaging 19%. He did not advertise. He was recommended to me by a compliance attorney at a different firm whom I had called cold, given 2 sentences of context, and asked, "If you were going to bring a case against a healthcare enrollment vendor, who would you want on the other side of the table as your qui tam counsel?" She said, "Ortega, Brickell. He will either take it or tell you who else to go to. He does not take cases he does not intend to win." I made an appointment. I drove to Miami. I brought the 340-page evidentiary binder I had assembled in the preceding 3 weeks. I brought the folder Amara had given me. I did not bring the 14 composition notebooks, which I had never taken out of my home office, but I brought scanned PDFs of the architectural rationale entries relevant to the audit subsystem and to the memorandum chain. Marshall's receptionist gave me coffee. I waited 7 minutes. Marshall came out. He was tall. He was wearing a dark blue suit without a tie. He shook my hand. He said, "Mr. Kane, come in." I went in. We sat at a small conference table in his office for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He read every page of the binder. He asked me questions in the order I would have asked them if I had been a federal investigator. He asked me about the provenance of every document. He asked me about the chain of custody of Amara's memo. He asked me about the audit subsystem, about whether my access had been provisioned formally, about whether I had signed any document limiting my access after the elevation, about whether the read-only role had ever been formally revoked in writing. I had the answers. He asked me whether I had ever taken source code from the company. I said no, and I explained the distinction between source code and architectural work product, and I showed him Section 7.4 of my 2014 employment agreement. He read the section twice. He asked me whether anyone at Meridian, to my knowledge, knew I had continued to query the audit subsystem. I said no. He asked me whether I understood, if I proceeded, that the case would be filed under seal, that I would be bound by law not to discuss it with anyone except my counsel, that the seal could, and very likely would, extend beyond the statutory 60 days by additional government request, that during the seal period, I would be expected to continue to appear at my place of employment and behave as if nothing was happening, and that if I did not do so, I would both imperil my relator status and the integrity of the investigation. I said I understood. He said, "Mr. Kane, I am taking this case. My retainer on a contingency basis is 40% of any recovery, standard for qui tam at this scale, plus costs. I will file under the Southern District of Florida. I estimate the seal will last between 12 and 24 months. During that period, your job is to keep showing up to that office and to keep writing in your notebooks and to tell no one. Can you do that?" I said I could. We signed the engagement letter at 4:50 on a Thursday afternoon. I drove back to Tampa. I was home by 8:30. I took my mother to 8 o'clock Mass that Sunday. I did not tell her. Marshall filed the qui tam complaint, which ran to 268 pages, including exhibits, under seal in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida on the 11th of April, 2025. The filing triggered a statutory 60-day investigation window for the Department of Justice to determine whether to intervene. Within the first 30 days, Marshall received a call from an assistant United States attorney named Denise Cho, who was 41 years old and a 12-year veteran of the Civil Division. She opened the investigation. She requested a full oral briefing. Marshall and I met her in a secure conference room in the Federal Building in Miami in early June. Ms. Cho was precise. She asked more questions than Marshall had asked. She asked about data retention. She asked about subpoena readiness of the Audit Subsystem exports. She asked me whether I would be willing, at the appropriate time, to sit for a formal interview with a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I said yes. Ms. Cho said the matter would proceed. The seal was extended to 180 days by government request. It was extended again. It was extended again. It was extended a fourth time. In total, it lasted 22 months. I want to describe the 22 months briefly because they shape the residue of this story. Every weekday, I drove from my house in Town and Country to the Meridian building on West Shore Boulevard. I arrived at 8:30. I badged into the lobby, into the elevator, into the quiet room. I sat under the buzzing fluorescent fixture. I worked on the strategic study. I wrote nothing useful in the strategic study. I ate my lunch at my desk. I left at 5:30. I drove home. I cooked for myself. 2 days a week, I drove to my mother's apartment after work. I made her dinner. On Saturdays, I took her to the grocery store and to her hairdresser in Carrollwood. On Sundays, I took her to 8 o'clock Mass at St. Lawrence, and every first Sunday of the month, I nodded at the wooden bench beside the park next to her apartment building. And every first Sunday of the month, there was an envelope on that bench, until Terrence's flow of screenshots was paused by Marshall in October of 2025. For evidentiary reasons, I do not need to explain here. I did not tell my mother anything. I did not tell my children anything. I did not tell Father Joseph Mariquin anything. I did not tell anyone. I wrote, in the notebook, once a week. I kept my face composed. Dalton and Sabrina were unaware. In May of 2025, the company announced a vendor relationship expansion with a new regional carrier in North Carolina. In September of 2025, Dalton sent a company email titled, "Second Year of Velocity," claiming enrollment volume was now 340% above pre-recapitalization baseline. In November of 2025, Sabrina was given a Rising Star Award at an industry conference in Las Vegas. I saw the photograph in her LinkedIn feed. I did not comment. In March of 2026, the company distributed the engineering organizational chart again, still showing me reporting alone to Dalton under strategic architecture initiatives, and I noticed that Terrence Abrams had been promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations. I did not acknowledge him. He did not acknowledge me. We continued past each other in the cafeteria without eye contact. In August of 2026, the private equity firm Wentworth Capital Partners disclosed in its quarterly investor letter that Meridian was its single highest performing portfolio company and that it expected a liquidity event in the 18 to 24-month horizon. The letter was public. Marshall sent it to me with a single line of commentary. "Not this time." I did not laugh. I saved the letter. The seal broke on a Wednesday morning in January of 2027. Federal search warrants were executed simultaneously at 6:15 in the morning, local time, at 3 locations: the Meridian headquarters on West Shore Boulevard, Dalton Reese's residence on Davis Islands, and Sabrina Lowell's residence in the Sunset Park neighborhood of South Tampa. 3 Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents arrived at the Meridian building in a quiet line of unmarked sedans. Special Agent Daryl Trenton, who was 48 years old and led the Tampa field office's healthcare fraud unit, met the building manager at the lobby. Assistant United States Attorney Cho arrived with 2 Department of Justice Civil Division attorneys and 1 HHS Office of Inspector General special agent. Warrants for hard drive imaging, for physical removal of paper records from the compliance office, and for the seizure of 2 servers located in the data center on the 3rd floor were presented. Warrants at the 2 private residences covered personal devices, paper files, and financial records. Dalton was not arrested that morning. He was served. He was cooperative, I am told, with the special agents who arrived at his door. Sabrina was not arrested that morning either. She was served in her driveway as she was preparing to drive her children to school. I was not present at any of the 3 locations. I was told to remain at my home by Marshall, who had been notified the previous evening by Miss Cho that the seal would be broken in the morning. I sat on my couch with a cup of coffee at 6:15. I watched nothing. I did not turn on a television. I did not open a newspaper. I did not go to work that day or the next day. On the third day, Friday, I went back in. The quiet room was still there. The fluorescent fixture still buzzed. The glass award still sat on the desk where I had placed it in June of 2024. I sat down. I opened the notebook. I wrote, Day 72 of 2027. The seal is broken. I am at my desk. I closed the notebook. I looked at the fluorescent fixture. For the first time in 31 months, I smiled. What followed I will describe in brief because you can read the public record, which is long and formal, and in the places that matter does not need me to restate it. Meridian Coverage Solutions entered federal receivership on the 14th of February, 2027. All federal and state contracts were terminated. All 320 employees were laid off within 4 weeks. A receiver was appointed. The assets were frozen pending civil judgment and restitution orders. On the 11th of March, 2027, a grand jury sitting in the Middle District of Florida returned indictments against Dalton Reese and Sabrina Lowell. Dalton was charged under Title 18, United States Code Section 1343, with 8 counts of wire fraud, under Title 18, United States Code Section 1347, with 14 counts of healthcare fraud, and under Title 18, United States Code Section 371, with 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States. Sabrina was charged with 6 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. 2 senior executives at Meridian, whom I will not name here because their cooperation agreements are sealed, entered into non-prosecution cooperation agreements with the Department of Justice. In June of 2027, Dalton and Sabrina entered plea agreements for reduced counts. They were both sentenced in November of 2027. I do not know what their children were told. In October of 2027, the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida entered civil judgment against Meridian Coverage Solutions and against Dalton Reese and Sabrina Lowell in their individual capacities, jointly and severally in part, and individually in part. The total civil judgment was $147,800,000. Of that amount, $112,400,000 represented restitution to the Medicare and Medicaid Services federal trust funds. $35,400,000 represented statutory civil penalties under the False Claims Act. Additional costs were assessed against the defendants. The key TAM relator share, determined by Department of Justice formula and court review, was set at 18% of the federal recovery. My gross share was $26,604,000. Marshall Ortega's contingency fee of 40% was $10,640,000. My net recovery, before taxes, was $15,964,000. The first distribution arrived in November of 2027. I deposited it in the credit union across town, where the retention grant money had been sitting for 3 years. I did not withdraw any of it for 6 weeks. I want to tell you what happened with the 12,417 individuals, because that matters more to me than the recovery. The Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General initiated a nationwide notification protocol in January of 2028. Of the 12,417 enrollees, 8,200 were located alive. All of them were retroactively de-enrolled from the Meridian-placed plans. Letters were sent in English and in Spanish. Follow-up calls were made. Where a person was found to be eligible for Medicaid, a facilitation was offered to connect them to the correct state program. Where a person had been enrolled without consent and had previously qualified for Medicaid but been placed inappropriately in a subsidized marketplace plan, a retroactive claim for any adverse out-of-pocket exposure was offered through HHS. Approximately 6,100 of the 8,200 responded to the outreach. Approximately 2,100 of them refused follow-up contact. They had their reasons. I do not second-guess them. 1,914 of the enrollees were deceased. For each one, identity theft reports were filed with the Federal Trade Commission, and with the Social Security Administration. Next of kin were located in approximately 1,400 cases. Personal letters were sent to those next of kin explaining, in plain language, that the decedent's identity had been used in a fraud scheme and that no financial liability attached to the estate. Those letters were signed by Priscilla Iglesias of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Center for Program Integrity. They did not mention my name. 2,303 of the enrollment records could not be matched to a living or deceased identifiable person. These were, in the aggregate, identities constructed from partial information, overlaid on real addresses from homeless shelters or abandoned housing listings, with sufficient plausibility to satisfy the soft validation paths that the commission-driven operators had been running through. I do not know who those 2,303 people were supposed to be. The federal prosecutors do not know either. The records were voided. In February of 2028, I received a phone call at my home from a man named Andrew Costanza. He was 61 years old. He was calling from Miami. He had received, 2 weeks earlier, a letter from the Department of Health and Human Services explaining that his late mother, a woman named Maribel Costanza, who had died of congestive heart failure in 2019 at the age of 84, had, in 2023, been enrolled in a health insurance plan through a company called Meridian Coverage Solutions, and that monthly federal subsidy payments had been made on her behalf for approximately 26 months. The letter told him that no financial liability attached to her estate, which had been closed in 2020. The letter told him that if he had questions, he could call a toll-free number. He had called the toll-free number. He had not been able to understand what he was told. Somewhere in the course of the conversation, an intake operator at HHS gave him a number that was, through an administrative chain I will not attempt to reconstruct, routed to my private home number. He called. He asked me if I had known his mother. I said I had never known her. He asked me how her name had come to be on an insurance plan. I told him, carefully, and in the plainest language I could assemble, that a company had used her name without consent to collect monthly payments from the federal government, that the company was now gone, that the people responsible were facing federal prison, that no one owed anything, that what had happened to his mother was wrong, and that I was sorry for it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Sir, are you one of the people who caught them?" I said, "I was one of them." He said, "Did they know her?" I said, "Sir, I believe they did not. I believe they picked her name from a public death record because they needed a name." He began to cry. I stayed on the phone. We talked for 41 minutes. He told me about his mother. He told me she had been a cashier at a grocery store in Little Havana for 32 years. He told me she had raised 3 children by herself after his father died in a crash in 1984. He told me she had been proud of her English. He told me she would not have wanted her name on something like that. I told him I knew. We did not discuss compensation. We did not discuss me. I did not tell him I was the whistleblower. He did not ask. Before he hung up, he said, "Mr. Kane, thank you for calling me back." I said, "Mr. Costanza, thank you for calling." I hung up the phone. I sat in my kitchen. I looked at the window for a long time. The sun was coming through the jalousie slats. In March of 2028, with Father Joseph Marroquin's counsel and with my mother's signature on the dedication, I established the Elena Kane Memorial Scholarship Fund at St. Lawrence Catholic Parish. The fund provides 2 annual scholarships of $12,000 each to nursing students pursuing rural health certifications. The first 2 recipients were announced in December of 2028. One of them was a young woman from Plant City named Marisol Vega. The other was a young man from Wauchula named Thomas Bautista. I did not attend the announcement. I sent a check. I sent a second check in 2029. I expect to send one every year until I cannot any longer. I sold the house in Town and Country in the summer of 2028. I moved to a smaller place in Carrollwood, 4 minutes by car from my mother's apartment. I brought the 14 notebooks with me. I brought the shelf. I rebuilt it in the new home office. The notebooks are there now. I continue to write in the 2028 and 2029 volumes when I have something to write. I have not yet finished the 2029 volume. I expect I will. The glass award is on a shelf in my kitchen. It is between a coffee canister and an old radio I have been repairing for 2 years. I do not dust it often. I do not move it. I do not throw it out. It catches the kitchen light in the morning. I am not upset when I see it. I simply look at it, and then I look at something else. I work, unpaid, approximately 10 hours a week for the Hillsborough County Healthcare Navigator Coalition, which is a nonprofit enrollment assistance organization funded in part by the local county health department. I help Medicaid-eligible elderly residents enroll in the correct public programs. I am very good at this work. I am careful, which is what the work requires. I have not told my mother any of this story. I do not believe I will.
She is 88 now.
She reads in Spanish in the evenings. She still goes to 8 o'clock Mass every Sunday. She likes that I drive her. She does not ask me what I do during the week. I make her breakfast on Sunday mornings. I make her the kind of café cubano my father used to make for her in the 1970s. She tells me it is too strong. She drinks it anyway. Elena has been dead for 16 years. I have thought about what she would say if she could know what the platform became and what I did about it. I cannot resolve honestly what she would say. I know she would tell me she was proud of me. I know she would also tell me it took too long. I know she would laugh at the glass award. I know she would ask me whether I was taking care of our mother. I do not think she would ask me how much money I received. That is not the kind of question she would ask. I am 61 years old. I live alone. I am well. I make my own meals. I go to Mass. I see my children when they can come, which is not often, and which is right, because their lives are their own. I do not resent what happened. I do not celebrate what happened. I do not feel proud of the number of indictments, or of the recovery, or of the ruined careers of the 2 people who thought they had run me out of the building in the summer of 2024. I feel, when I feel anything about it at all, that a piece of work which had been done with great care for a decade was used, for a brief period, to harm people it was supposed to help, and that my responsibility was to notice and to act. I noticed and I acted. I was one of many. The Department of Justice did the hard part. The special agent did the hard part. Ms. Cho did the hard part. Marshall did the hard part. Amara Feldman did the hard part. Terrence Abrams, who I have not spoken to since the day the seal broke, did his own hard part. Penny Arroyo did her part. The CMS compliance infrastructure, which ran quietly in the background of the most extractive era in the company's history, did its part. I wrote a book about how the system should think. The book was right. On the 20th of December, 2027, after the last federal distribution cleared my account, I drove to my mother's apartment at 7 in the morning. I had been up since 5. I had been at my kitchen table. I had opened the 2027 notebook, which still had pages left. I had written, on the first empty page, the date, and beneath the date, a single line. I wrote, "The platform is gone, the people remain." I had closed the notebook. I had put it on the shelf. I had put on a coat. I had driven to my mother's apartment. She was in her kitchen. She was in her robe. She had not yet made coffee. I made the coffee. I made her toast. I sat down across from her at her small table by the window. She looked at me. She said, in the particular inflection she uses when she knows I am carrying something without telling her, "Mi hijo, ¿estás bien?" I said, "Sí, mama, estoy bien." She looked at me for a moment longer. She did not ask again. We ate our toast. We drank our coffee. The sun came through her window. I was quiet. She was quiet. The platform was gone. The people remained. That is the whole story.